And if you'll now join me in welcoming our final panel. These are individuals who need almost no introductions, but I'll go ahead and do it anyways. Please help me welcome to the stage Governor Jerry Brown, Governor of California, U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, and Angel Gurría from the OECD.
That's a very bright light.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I'm sure all of you are completely exhausted.
No, that's not
Not
true.
at all?
No.
The time difference is...
You don't look exhausted.
None of us are. You've actually been in rooms negotiating for the past week, though. Let me start with this question. This is the final... We had Secretary of State John Kerry on stage this morning. He said he thought that we would have an agreement a year from now, 3 years from now. How does the world look different if we actually get some type of agreement out of COP21? Governor Brown?
Well, it's going to look different because for the first time ever, there's an authoritative pronouncement that carbon pollution is real, it's an existential problem, and the countries of the world are committed, each with their own commitments, to do something real about it. So that's never been the case. There hasn't been this level of unanimity. From that statement, the message goes forth to business, to politicians, to nations, to do things. So I think with respect to California, this will undergird our policies and allow us to go even further in our ambitious efforts to cut oil 50% renewable, and double our efficiency and our the rate that we're improving our buildings. So what it is it's giving greater authority in the face of the Republican denial, the business recalcitrance, where that is. We had one of our recent, just yesterday, the CEO of our 8th largest company poo-poo all what we're doing here in Paris. So the fact that there's so much agreement in such a formal way will allow for significant reductions to show up over the next couple of years. And it will help weaken the Tea Party, the climate denier, the whole skeptical apparatus, which, like the tobacco companies of 20 years ago, are sowing doubt and engaging in very sophisticated obfuscation. So that's the real meaning here, that we're getting a boost from the understanding that people will generally have after this.
It makes a ton of sense. And Secretary Moniz, let me ask you this. What would you see as the signs of success and failure, even if an agreement comes out, right? Because there's good agreements and there's bad agreements. If we see something come out, what should this audience and the world use as a yardstick for success and failure?
Well, first of all, just to amplify on what Governor Brown said, I think the fact that we had virtually every country in the world coming forward with an INDC with varying commitments to greenhouse gas emission reduction, I think is very significant. So now, response to your question, I'd say number one is how are we going to see those plans implemented, and we'll see how the agreement comes out in terms of verification measures, but bottom line is how are we going to implement those INDCs? Number two, how are we in the future going to increase the level of ambition, which we need to do as well? I will just give one part of the answer, which is certainly the theme that I've been here to emphasize, and that is the innovation agenda that, in fact, this COP has elevated very much to a central part of the response to the climate challenge. If I may just add to that, I'd say that that will be manifest as we continue the cycle of innovation, increased deployment, and cost reduction. We've seen that now just since Copenhagen with dramatic reductions in costs of certain technologies, some wind, some solar, some LEDs. We are seeing the results in terms of incredibly fast deployment, but we need more of it, and that, of course, is what we saw 20 countries plus the investor network led by Bill Gates, announced on the first day of COP.
A huge announcement, tremendous funding going in. Let me follow up on that very briefly. As a former nuclear physicist, I don't know if you're once a nuclear physicist, you're always a nuclear physicist.
Fallen physicist. You know.
Why? So a great deal of the conversation around R&D has been funding for R&D. How much of that is coming from subnationals like California, from federal governments, from cooperatives like OECD that are coming together? How important is the government's role in pushing that innovation versus creating a platform where industry innovates on its own? Can we rely on industry to innovate if we have an agreement in place where we know that there's going to need to be decarbonization? Or does there need to be federal and subnational spurs to that?
Is that for Angel or for me?
Go ahead, yeah, please.
Oh, okay. I'll just follow
You're
up.
the physicist.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for the compliment. Just to follow up on that. Well, actually, I'm going to draw upon the recent writings of Bill Gates, who has clearly identified the important role of in the United States, frankly, the Department of Energy, in terms of some of these earlier stage investments in innovation. Now, those investments, let's say our program called ARPA-E, their first 140 awards, they were created in 2009, led to 30 startup companies. So that's already an issue of getting into the commercial space, obviously. Many of those companies, in turn, as they progress, have been taken over by much bigger companies. One of the technologies we had here on display was, in fact, a novel flying wind turbine technology that is now part of Google X. So it's about creating investable opportunities. What was new here last week was the 28 international investors that Bill Gates represented, who are willing now to put in billions of dollars of capital that is more patient and more risk tolerant than is typical, because they have confidence in the expanded innovation pipeline because of the 20-country commitment to double R&D.
Mr. Gurría, obviously the OECD focuses on cooperation. It's part of the name of the organization. When you think about these negotiations and you think about the cooperation that you've already seen across nationals, what has been the missing piece when you're trying to encourage cooperation, when you're trying to negotiate with members to OECD? What is stumbling blocks that need to be removed in order to see progress on this issue?
Well, take the opposite of what the governor and the secretary mentioned and take it as a negative. It says we now have 100 or 180 or 184, whatever, INDCs. Imagine we didn't have it. And what makes it possible to think about an agreement with teeth, it's because the teeth were there first. The teeth arrived. These kinds of deals have dentists, which are very good at taking away the teeth in the last 2 nights. They go out the nights, and then you take a lot of teeth away, and then in the end you get these agreements that don't bite. So the thing is that now they got the teeth there first, all the commitments of the countries, and then there was a kind of a one-upmanship, which I found extremely engaging, and encouraging. That was that because they saw that the others were doing that, they were getting ambitious, and the U.S. started, by the way. Here, congrats to the secretary, because with the China deal, that kind of sparked the whole thing about ambition. So that's pretty important. Now, these are also requisites of the kind of the thing that has to happen. It has not happened, by the way. It's happening as we speak. There's going to be today. There's going to be some kind of draft coming out of the Europeans and the Africans or whatever. So it's only Wednesday, so we still have about 48 hours or 72 hours to go, and maybe they'll stretch. Who knows? Friday can go on forever and ever and ever. But the question is, then, think if we don't get to a price. So that's the bad side. The good side is, what if we are all convinced by now that there has to be a big fat price on carbon? We know the enemy is going to just, well, come on. We know the enemy. We know its ugly face. We have to hit it with a big blunt instrument on the head. A big fat price on carbon is what we today had this morning with the long-term institutional investors for climate, and that's the part that will allow you to go from the billions to the trillions. And they were saying, "Give me a price, give me a price." The oil companies are saying, "Give me a price." It looks, this is totally contrary to what was happening, 2-3 years ago, where they were saying, "What about this price issue?" They felt offended. Right now they're saying, "Give me a price so that I can take investment decisions." I'm convinced we have to go for clean, we have to go for lower emissions, etc. But give me a price for that. But if you're going to go and tax or put a price on carbon, how about first stop subsidizing it? Stop subsidizing the use of it. Stop subsidizing giving tax rates to cars, to flotillas of company cars. How about, did you know that the least taxed of all sources of energy is coal, which is the most polluting? I mean, we are very crazy. We're undoing with one hand, we're misaligning all the policy. We're undoing with one hand what we're trying to do so desperately with the other hand. We have a whole inventory of support measures for fossil fuels. At least 200 billion, the IEA says 500 billion. Others have even bigger calculations. Again, it's crazy because that is 5 times what we dedicate to support renewables and at least 2 to 3 times what we're seeking so desperately. The 100 billion, the famous 100 billion for developing countries, that is what we spend, a multiple of that we spend in subsidies. So we gotta get our act together.
So this is a great point. Let's talk about that, because both of you represent governments or lead governments where there are some subsidies for fossil fuels. Both of you have worked hard to take back some of those subsidies, but it's an uphill battle. What works? What if we're talking to this audience and we're giving them marching orders to go in and advocate to their representatives and their respective governments? What should they be telling them to help bring back the subsidies for fossil fuels that seem to be distorting the system?
Take them off and then go beyond with the price on carbon. California has a cap and trade system that essentially puts a $13 cost, pretty low, but higher than the common market, lower than what British Columbia is doing. And that can be ratcheted up. And we have partners, Quebec, Ontario, others will join us. So that is a price on carbon. It generates money because the companies who pollute have to buy allowances if they don't live within the cap. That's raising $2.5 billion that we can then channel into technologies and measures that reduce our carbon footprint. So that's a concrete example. Now, do many states follow it? No. A few are talking about it. If we can get more, that's a good thing. But it's nice to talk about a carbon tax, but from a political point of view, tax is always a bad specter that you tend to avoid. So, and if, by the way, if there's a subsidy, then you want to take it away, people don't like it. We have a ethanol mandate that doesn't make any sense, but very hard to take it away. So it's hard to do things that cost somebody, and the only way you can affect somebody that is going to cost them is to have allies that are more powerful. I mean, that's the strong don't yield, the weak yield.
So who are the allies then? Let's talk about the U.S. for a second, right? California has been a leader on this. You and your colleagues have managed to put systems in place that are much more progressive than the rest of the country. Who are the allies
I'll tell you
that the federal government needs?
Well, Mr. Tom Steyer was we had the measure. California has a cap and trade program, a low carbon fuel standard, that was put to a ballot, to a vote of the people through our popular initiative process that is triggered by 5% of the people signing a petition. That was sponsored by two Texas oil companies. Who opposed them? Secretary George Shultz, Republican Secretary of State under Reagan. Other electric utilities who are supportive of what we're trying to do, they fought. So it was a few oil companies, not all, fighting some wealthy people, some enlightened individuals of prominence, and the oil companies were defeated by over 20 points. So that put to a popular test. Also, we now have under the cap and trade program, we have gasoline, the vehicle sector, and that was they spent millions. Certain companies, the oil companies, spent millions of dollars saying this is a tax on your buying fuel. It's going to raise costs, terrible. It's going to take away your car, and there was some muddled message like that. Went nowhere. Now it coincided with the oil prices falling. So when we imposed cap and trade on gasoline prices went down $1. So it was very hard for the oil companies, and they're a little slow reacting, the ones who paid for this. They're buying television ads and doing mailers, scaring people that they're going to lose their ability to buy gasoline, and the world went the other way. So it is a political battle, and anytime you're imposing costs or taking away subsidies, it only can occur if the people who are allied with you are more powerful than the people whom you're trying to disadvantage, even though it's for the benefit of the whole community.
Secretary Moniz, go ahead.
Well, just to amplify a little bit on that same question, first of all, Governor Brown mentioned George Shultz, and I would just say he's an example of many who are advocating strongly for what's called a revenue-neutral carbon pricing, which probably has somewhat more political future than other ways of using the revenue. But I also want to note that clearly at the federal government level we do not have carbon pricing, and that does not look to be imminent. But number one, there's a long history of states, California, the Northeast, states being laboratories and proving grounds for policies that ultimately become adopted at the federal level. A second point I will make is that we do have something, it's caused some controversy, first applied at the Department of Energy, called the social cost of carbon. So we have had economic analyses about what is the cost of the marginal ton of CO2 emitted or avoided. We are using about $37 right now as that social cost of carbon, which we use in cost-benefit analyses for regulatory steps, for standards, et cetera. Third point, final point, is that in the absence of an explicit cost on carbon, and a cost on carbon, clearly economists are pretty united in saying that this is an efficient way of getting a market-driven, a lower-cost implementation. But it's not the only tool. So currently, President Obama's action plan is based upon current executive authorities. That means inherently it's a sector-by-sector approach, like the Clean Power Plan for the power sector. It's not an explicit price, but it is going after the same objective of limiting carbon emissions.
So go ahead.
Let me just say, California is. There's also the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the states in the Northeast U.S. But the problem is it is producing, as the governor said, $13. Okay, that's a signal of don't do it. In British Columbia, they started some time ago, and they said they started at about that level, but then it's a predictable rise over time. Now it's in the 30s, and it's going to continue to go up. The French said they're 17. They're going to go to 30. They're going to go to 50. So, and the Swedes have 100 euros per ton of avoided, and they seem to be happy. Thank you very much, and they're not losing competitiveness, etc. But so the question is, we're all over the place. Some countries are still subsidizing. So we have all the way from subsidies. Some countries actually subsidize it more than the whole budget for education. These are some of the poorest countries in the world. So it's a total misallocation of these resources. And then even in the OECD countries, we have obviously this big mosaic, from nothing to 13 to 100. So the question is, I say this because 37. Secretary said this is the social cost of emissions. Okay, so we have a reference. Let's say 37. Okay, if that can be kind of the target, that can be maybe the starting point for those who are in a position to do it, because ETSs, cap and trade systems, are not giving us the right numbers. In Europe, we've started this 4 times. 4 times it dropped to single digits. It didn't fly. In China, they have 7 pilot programs that they started. It's not flying. So what can I say? You know, Ontario, on the other hand, Ontario and Quebec are joining California and making it work. So we do not seem to have a very efficient cap and trade mechanics or concept that will produce the right numbers, not anywhere close to the 37. Whereas putting, as I said, a big fat price on it and saying why you're doing it is
and I want to ask
seems
about
to work
compliance,
better.
which seems at the heart of this. Before I do, let me ask one other question. There's carrots and sticks in this conversation, right? Secretary Moniz, you've spoken a great deal about the need for greater innovation, for pushing innovation. A lot of the conversation at Paris is focused on the sticks, on using sticks to fight powerful interests. Are we doing enough on carrots? Are we giving enough support to R&D? Are nationals and subnationals doing enough to go out there and to spur innovation that the market might not be able to generate on its own, even if we see better pricing on carbon and decarbonization?
Well, the federal government provides most of the research money. But for example, we spend $2,500 for each electric car, each zero-emission vehicle that people buy. That's a direct subsidy. Federal government puts up $7,500. So that's helpful, $10,000 for buying a zero-emission vehicle.
Is that the solution? Can we rely on those
There's no
positives?
doubt if we up the subsidy, we'd have more car purchases. That's why when you see these car ads, they talk about, you know, the 1,000 back rebates and all that stuff. Yeah, that stuff does work, but we also need the research. You also have penalties. You can, like, for example, the utilities in California, the electric utilities, are now deriving about 25% of their electric energy from renewables. One electric utility in San Diego, very big city, millions of people, very prosperous, they're deriving 40%. So that's done with a mandate. That is, the state of California says, thou shalt have 1/3 of your electricity from renewables by 2020. So they're on that glide path. And then we have another law just passed this year, thou shalt have 50% by 2030. So those are mandates. They drive innovation. Analogous is not a subsidy, but in California, our regulators back in the 70s required the catalytic converter. That catalytic converter, among other restrictions that were mandated, has cleaned up the air in Los Angeles such that we have 90% less pollution than 40 or 50 years ago, with 2 or 3 times more automobiles, something that Beijing and New Delhi could only imagine in their fondest dreams. We're doing it. What was the mechanism? Not a subsidy, a law, a mandatory coercive command from the state, do it. And they did it. And so here's this interesting relationship between a well-designed regulation and innovation on the part of those who are regulated. Now, if you try to regulate in some stupid way, that's counterproductive. But if you can just push the industry a little further than it wants to go and keep doing that, then you make progress. Same thing with building efficiency. California has the strictest, most sophisticated construction standards of any place in America. Now, those standards were opposed to begin with. I know I was governor in the 70s when we created them, but every few years they're made more stringent. This is command and control resulting in decentralized innovation by thousands of different builders. So the command and control works. So does the market mechanism. It takes a blend. There is no silver bullet. You don't pull a switch and solve climate change. You have to do many, many things, and each place, it's different. And of course, the guiding point, when you say have a 37 price on carbon, there are probably industries that would be very, very, very disadvantaged. So they're going to fight that, and the people who work in those industries are the people who have to pay. So you have to find a way to alleviate these burdens. That's the problem. You can't just say no coal. What do you do about the coal workers? What do you do about the communities? You have to do some balancing.
Some shifting. Secretary Moniz, you've been a champion for innovation and for pushing for greater innovation. Do you think there's enough carrots that are being offered right now to drive that?
Well, clearly not, and that's in fact one of the motivations for this mission innovation with the commitment of doubling R&D. The scale of that, by the way, is adding approximately $10 billion per year by year 5 in these countries. But again, the focus of it will be to generate these investable opportunities for private investors to come in, especially with this view of more patience and more risk tolerance, which is going to be important. But I think, again, we have to remember the goal. I mean, so certainly things like financial incentives for deployment work together with innovation and cost reduction. I will say over and over and over again, ultimately it's about cost reduction as a key enabler for everything being discussed here. Cost reduction makes policy easier. It makes more ambition in the future easier. I would note, in fact, that Prime Minister Modi was one of the prime movers of this mission innovation. It was really France, United States, and India initially started this, and then we had 17 other countries come in to join us to really make it east-west, north-south, you name it. But Prime Minister Modi's statements a week ago Monday, they're often his statements about their need to supply electricity to 2022, the need to maintain what they are doing in this period are highlighted, and that's correct. However, he also stated that innovation and cost reduction would be the foundation of their being able to be much more aggressive in meeting their social needs while still driving down carbon in the future. So I think we need all of these tools. They all work together, but certainly increasing this innovation pipeline is absolutely critical.
Here's another. It takes a lot of people in different ways. The Chinese drove down the price of photovoltaics. In fact, to the point where American solar companies objected and got the Trade Commission to impose a 30% tariff,
and a number of them
countervailing duties.
ended up folding because they couldn't, and a number of American solar companies ended up going out of business because
but because the Chinese drove down the price, whether it was dumping or not, enabled California to get to the 25% renewable.
That's interesting.
Those photovoltaics are being installed. Thank you, China, for spending billions of dollars and lowering the price. So we can't do it in one place. We need many different places and things happening. So, there it is.
It makes a lot. Let's just take.
Let me just say, you don't need goodies. You don't need the carrots. The price is going to drive the signaling. Second, the regulation. Here, I totally agree with the governor. You need the price on one side and then the regulation. There are certain sectors, transport, for example, buildings, do not lend themselves to the same extent to the question of pricing. So the regulation and the laws then complete the picture. And then you let the competition do its thing. The innovation will come from the competition in order to get the market share, but to comply with the regulations and to clear the price. The price will be a great clearing signal. So, there's been a many times around factor of drop, for example, photovoltaic on solar, etc. You're seeing that almost as you speak, the price coming down. And then the point that the governor mentioned, if there is a good technology somewhere that is found, let's spread it out as much as possible. Technologies for green today pay 20% when they cross the borders, and coal does not pay taxes when it crosses the border. I mean, how crazy can we be?
Maybe I should add one comment because I think it's relevant to this. That again, things like the photovoltaic cost reductions are very, very real and very important. But we still have to remember that if we are going to go to a future where these are, for example, really dominant technologies, we have other challenges to meet. We have to meet the smart grid challenge. We have to meet the energy storage challenge.
Yeah.
So really, that's why all of these things really have to come
They have to work together. California is mandating, again, 1,300 megawatts of electrical storage by 2020. And Southern California Edison, a very big utility covering the Southern California, has already bought 250 megawatts. Now, it's very expensive, but we're driving technology through government, the law, the regulation, and the response. So, by the way, I want to say something because not just about photovoltaics. The car standards that now exist, that was a battle. These things aren't just academic ideas. All the major car companies, Toyota, General Motors, Ford, all sued California to stop our vehicle emission standards that we adopted several years ago. And Vermont followed our standards, little Vermont. So the auto companies sued Vermont not to adopt the California standards, and we had to go behind the scenes and help Vermont, and we finally beat them. So we beat all the automobile companies, then some of them went bankrupt, and then they got more friendly, and then they agreed, under the leadership of President Obama, to a national standard, which was the California standard. And the Supreme Court, just a little bit before this, ruled 5-4, one little vote, Justice Kennedy, that CO2 was it was a pollutant, a dangerous pollutant. Had that vote gone the other way, we would be nowhere. So these are battles that are both theoretical and highly concrete. And we had to invest millions of dollars in fighting the automobile companies. So we had, by the way, we had a 10% zero emission vehicle standard in California. It didn't work. One of the previous governors took it back. But then through all this battling, it's now back again. So we've now have 150,000 electric vehicles, 40% of the American market. And that's all I'm saying. There's so many battles on so many fronts in so many different parts of the world that it's just amazing that we're even as far as we are. And I'm hoping that this declaration coming out of Paris will be a push forward, but there is no switch to pull. There's thousands, tens of thousands of decisions and moves that people, government, business, and by the way, in that respect, California has started with Baden-Württemberg a under 2 MOU, keep it under 2 tons by 2050. That has now been signed by over 100 subnational jurisdictions. Some of them relatively small, some of them large, like Great Britain, not a subnational, but signed anyway, Holland, and the Republic of Germany, Federal Republic of Germany. So we're getting stuff done at the subnational level. And that's what, see, big countries like America is, in its congressional branch, is totally constipated. Well, in the face of that blockage, we have California and Oregon and Washington and other states that are providing forward movement. And we'll get other states. So I think this subnational coalition, this powerful force going forward, complements whatever you can get done at the nation state. So it's every level, cut subsidies, fossil fuel, add incentives, carrots, sticks, anything you can throw into the mix, we need it all. And even then, it's very daunting.
And I want to point out one distinction that I think everyone on this stage, I think, fundamentally agrees with each other, but there is differences and distinctions. There's differences between command and control. There's differences between using incentives when you don't have the levers at your advantage that you would like to in order to enforce command and control. We're out of time. Let me just ask each of you just briefly, this is our last panel of the day. We have many people in this audience who are going to go forth and advocate on behalf, try and create change inside their companies, inside their governments. If there's one thing that you hope that everyone carries away from this marching orders, what would they be? Let me start, Mr. Gurría, briefly with you.
Ambition, ambition, ambition. That means the resetting mechanisms, the 5 years. It means making very clear that 2 degrees is absolutely, the top. And the 1.5 is being discussed as something that we should drive for because there's going to be slippages, and because when you're talking about the ocean, you probably is 2 degrees is probably too much. So the resetting, and that means putting all the elements together. And I think in this particular case, you don't have a police that is going to take a country to jail because they did not comply on the emission. So the measuring, the verification, and the reporting, in a way, the naming and shaming, the socializing of who is doing what for whom, for mankind, is very, very important. And last but not least, of course, the financing for the poorest so that they can comply with the obligations under COP21.
Secretary Moniz, what do you hope that everyone carries away?
We don't have time. We need to really move briskly. We need to pick up the pace. nature's clock keeps ticking. We don't have the luxury of resetting it. So we have to really accelerate. And one component to that, I'm a one-trick pony, is the innovation agenda, providing more options for lower cost in meeting more ambitious targets is a very important part of that agenda.
Governor Brown?
The big point is climate change is real. It's profoundly dangerous. We have to do something about it. The more people who believe that, the better chance we are of getting the policies, all the things that have been talked about. But we need the underlying understanding, belief, conviction that we are going to tackle global warming, and we're going to create a world that works in tune with nature, not against it. And that's the biggest barrier, is the inability to imagine. How do you imagine the future? A horrible bad that we can prevent by acting now before the bad becomes real. So that to me is the biggest thing. Taking on climate change as a real imperative, along with all the other things people are talking about, making money, taking care of their family, getting out of the rain, whatever people have to do, entertain themselves, keep a job. Yeah,
Read the New York
alongside
Times.
with that, you've got to incorporate the belief that the climate is changing based on human activity, and humans as a group have to modify and change. And I think that also means different choices about how we live and how our economy works to be compatible with this new way of living in the world.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time. Please thank our panel. Enormously appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You
Secretary,
participate.
thank you so much. Thank you. Mr. Gurría, really appreciate it. Thank you.